Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Conference Board's monthly Window On series. And welcome for today's topic, which is the window on the future of America's heartland. A great subject and not one that has been discussed too much recently. But we are very happy to have you here. I just want to point out to everyone that today's webcast is being recorded, and we will have it on replay on our website and in podcasts. You also are able to earn CPE credits. If you look to the bottom of your screen, you can write in your name and the information and to gain complete credit for today's webcast. Also, we have a question box at the bottom left of this screen, if you can find it. We'd like to have you ask questions as they occur to you, and we will try to address them throughout the webcast, and so it appears to us real time so that we can engage directly with you. Please be sure and download the presentation. There's a file download pod up at the bottom of your screen as well. And again, complete the evaluation form at the end and give us any feedback that you have. The topics today will be to understand the Heartland as an economic entity, and the challenges that we have to deal with in the Heartland, and what is the future, and how does that compare with the coastal regions of the country? Is it the same? Is it different? Will they converge? We'll see what comes out of it. Today's panelists are Janine Bassett from General Mills, Ross Duvall from Heartland Forward, Thomas Wallstrom from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and I will now turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Bart van Ark, the Executive Vice President and Chief Economist of the Conference Board, who is in Holland today, which is apropos given his role as a professor in Holland. Bart, take it away. Bart, we can't hear you. I think your mic is muted.
My apologies.
Yes,
Can you
very
hear me
good.
now?
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so let's not lose more time. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. People are joining us, of course, from the United States for this topic, but even from Europe. So it's great to have you all on as an audience on our webcast. Thank you for making the introduction, Steve. This is a very important and interesting topic, the American Heartland, the middle of America, sometimes dubbed as the Midwest, or sometimes the Rust Belt, or the breadbasket, or sometimes a little bit more negatively as flyover country. But more recently, we have heard this great term, the American Heartland. And I like the term because I think it's a term that really shows how important this part of the United States is at the heart of the U.S. economy in terms of its share of population, in terms of its importance for GDP. Of course, often the heartland is associated with weaknesses in America's economy, with old industries or rural sectors that are deteriorating, or poverty, or sometimes even at its worst, some areas which have high levels of disabilities, or the opioid crisis. But that is very much a caricature, and not only is it untrue, but it is also really unfair, as it really ignores very important areas of dynamism that the region has, and even more so. You could argue that there are many areas in the American heartland that really have assets, critical assets, that could define the future of America's economy. So as Steve already said, we're going to talk today about sort of three main topics. First, on sort of how to understand America's heartland as an economic entity. It's such a diverse region, it's such a big region. How big or how important is the heartland? And does the concept of heartland really work also from a business perspective? And then we'll talk about the challenges that the region is facing. And I already mentioned some of them, but critical challenges are, for example, the challenges of demographics and aging populations and human capital, the difficulty to transform old economy hallmarks and to transform the labor market to create a sustainable agricultural sector, and what are the policies that are actually in place to make some change here. And we'll see that there are actually some really interesting initiatives in the region that really require governments and businesses and education systems to collaborate. So we'll talk a little bit about how these challenges are being met. And then in the last section of the webcast, we're really going to talk about the Heartland's future. and ask ourselves the question whether it's really true, this perception that the future of technological change and innovation is just on the East Coast and on the West Coast, or perhaps in the South in some places like Texas, or do we also see real new opportunities emerging in the heartland? And what do we know, for example, about metropolitan areas, which are also there, very important ones in the heartland area? So we'll talk about what is happening to the region and what kind of new initiatives are being undertaken. And as Steve said, we've got a fantastic panel. I just want to take a little bit more time to introduce that panel. First of all, Janine Bessette. Janine is the Vice President of Global Consumer Insights at General Mills. She's responsible for all the research and all the insights that General Mills is collecting about their consumers. But, as General Mills being a critical company in the heartland itself, also the company is deeply ingrained into the culture and into the ecosystem of the heartland. So, Janine, it's great to have you on, and we really hope to hear from you, your business perspective today.
Yeah, great to be here. Looking forward to it.
And then we have Ross De Vol. Ross is the President and CEO of Heartland Forward. Heartland Forward is a new initiative that actually has just started. Ross worked previously, or still working as a fellow with the Walton Family Foundation, based in Bentonville. And the purpose of Heartland Forward really is to provide an independent and a very data-driven research program, but also an action-oriented program to really look at the opportunities that the heartland has and provide the policy recommendations to the policy communities in that part of the world. So Ross has previously worked, as I said, for the Walton Family Foundation. He's been involved with a study with Brookings Institution in Washington that got a lot of play on the heartland, and previously also worked with the Milken Institute. So it's great to have you on and benefit from all your knowledge about the American heartland, Ross.
Thank you very much for having me, Bart.
And then Thomas Wallstroms. Thomas is a business economist in the Economic Research Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. As you know, the Federal Reserve System is focusing quite often on what is happening in the regions of their interest. So the Federal Reserve of Chicago is focusing not just on the Midwest, although that is the primary area of interest, but also more broadly on all the issues that the American heartland is facing. And he's also involved in the bank's Midwest Economy blog, so he's very knowledgeable about the economic aspects of the region. So it's great to benefit from your knowledge also, Thomas.
Great, thanks for having me.
And then finally, Steve, just to introduce you, Steve, CEO and President of the Conference Board. But Steve also previously has a long record as a CEO of Office Depot, CEO of AutoZone, and been deeply involved with quite a few other companies that actually were headquartered in the heartland, or have very large customer bases in that part of the world. So, Steve, we really look forward to you also to hear sort of your experience as a business leader in that part of the world. Good. Okay, so with that, let's sort of go straight away now to the first section, where really we want to talk a little bit about the American heartland. I already gave some of these names that the American heartland is being looked at. This is the slide coming from some of the work that's been done at Heartland Forward. So at the minimum, what we talk about is sort of the northern part of the heartland. That is typically sort of the traditional Rust Belt, including Wisconsin and Iowa and Illinois and Indiana, Michigan, sort of the northeastern part on this chart. You got then sort of more what is called the breadbasket states, so that's North and South Dakota, Nevada, Kansas is there, and Missouri. And then, of course, there is sort of the more southern heartland, which typically tends to be the somewhat more traditionally, at least poorer and more agricultural area, although actually that part has made quite a bit of catch-up over the past few decades, at least until the financial crisis. Now, Ross, let me go to you, because to a large extent, you are responsible for this word, heartland, and it is a very large part of the country. How large is it in terms of population and economy-wise? And what, in your view, makes it different from the rest of America? And why should we look at this as sort of a separate entity in the economy? How do we benefit from that?
Well, thank you, Bart. As we were addressing what geographic area we would include in our definition under Heartland Forward, I embarked on a research effort called Perspectives on Defining the American Heartland. And let me just say that a shared vision of what the geographic area that comprises the heartland is an elusive topic. We all kind of innately share ideology and geographic orientation, but during this research I came across a definition actually in the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, which states, and I'm going to quote it here, the central geographic region of the United States in which mainstream values or traditional values predominate. And the central is a really key component of this. By my take, you can't include any of the original 13 colonies in the American Heartland. And you have to include parts of the South because they are central. So by my definition, I would include the census region called East North Central, Ohio up through Wisconsin, the West North Central, from Missouri up to North Dakota. But I also include the East South Central, that's Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi, as well as the West South Central, so Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and I would include Texas in that definition. This map does not have Texas on it, but in going back at it and looking at that central definition, we determined that it really needed to be in there. So if we were to define the Heartland as a country within a country, its economy would be the third largest in the world. It would have 127 million people. It would have a GDP of 6.5 trillion, and exports would represent almost 13% of GDP in the region as opposed to just about 9% for the rest of the country. So while there are many dissimilarities among the states in the Heartland, I think the common characteristics bring them together. And one of those common characteristics is advanced manufacturing, which has expanded into the southern states, and I think it drew them closer together. Thank you.
Right. So one question here. You already mentioned this issue of taxes, whether that should be included or not. But there's also a question here, actually, somebody saying, well, but what about the states that are sort of on the western frontier, so west of this line here? My question is, well, if we do that, if we add in Texas and those states, then basically it's everything in America except the coastal states on the west and the east. And then the question is whether the concept is still very useful. What's your view on that?
Well, some economic geographers would expand it all the way to include some of the eastern mountain states. To me, that's just not the Heartland because they're not central. There's a reason why the Census Bureau has 4 census regions that are called central, and they exactly comprise these 20 states.
Right. Now, Thomas, as I said earlier, obviously in Chicago, you're sitting sort of more in the northeast of this region. When you look at this as an economist, right, would you say, do you see more differences between the sub-regions in this very large area, or do you see that there is really a difference between this heartland and the rest of the United States from an economist perspective?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think Ross is right. I think when I think of an economic region, I think first of kind of the industrial mix of the place. And when you look at the industrial mix of the Midwest, which is the area that I focus on, it's very manufacturing intensive, and it's also an agricultural center as well. But if you expand it in the way that Ross has in terms of defining this American Heartland, I think that also makes sense. There's plenty of agriculture further west of the kind of the traditional Midwest states, and then, as you both have already mentioned, we've seen over the past half century manufacturing migrating south from the Midwest into the South, and I think that's made the South look a lot more like the Midwest in terms of the challenges it faces. And where its prosperity comes from. I haven't mentioned oil and gas, but that's also obviously an important part of the mix for this whole region. And in fact, even I can say that for the Midwest, where we don't actually do a ton of oil and gas exploration because we're so manufacturing intensive, we do a lot of exporting to places where they do oil and gas development. So I think it is a very reasonable thing to put this whole region together and contrast it with other parts of the country.
Now, Janine, as I said earlier, General Mills obviously has its roots in the heartland, although obviously it's a very global company today. But do you still think there is value both on the supply side, where General Mills relies very heavily on America's agricultural sector, or on the side of sort of company values that Ross also alluded to earlier, to really be in the heartland? Does it make a difference?
Yeah, that's right. This company grew up on the shores of and the banks of the Mississippi River with our flour mills, and even now we've got plants scattered throughout the heartland, from Joplin, Missouri, to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And we love having our plants right down the middle because we're close to materials, a strong workforce, and we're equidistant from the coast from a distribution standpoint. In terms of company values, it's true. We're a Midwestern company. We've got values of Middle America, and those tend to play out, in our brands. I would say in recent years, where there's been almost this overemphasis on millennials and real food and the trends that come with it, I think it caused some companies to lose their way a little bit and stray from the core values of their legacy brands. And I can talk about one of those brands, Pillsbury, one of our most iconic brands. A couple years ago, we had lost our way and started, chasing some of those emerging trends. And as we look back over those previous 2 years, we had lost 4 points of penetration, over 3.5 million households, just on the Pillsbury brand. We thought to ourselves, we need to reconnect with our core consumers and in the heartland to make sure we're representing their values. So we hit the road. We went to states like Iowa, Kentucky, Tennessee, and we went into consumers' homes. Because you can't write a survey or run a focus group to understand what consumers' values are. You need to be in their homes, and so we did. And we looked at their walls, and we saw a lot of signs on the wall. I mean, literally, their values were on the wall. You've probably seen these signs where it says, our family is all about forgiveness and kindness, or in our house, we love one another. We saw those signs in their homes, and we saw families saying grace, and we saw multiple generations, and we looked at what was on the refrigerator doors, and we took all that insight and converted that into a campaign called Made at Home. And when we built that campaign, we showed consumers' homes with those signs on the wall. We showed families holding hands and saying grace. We showed moms taking phones out of their kids' hands, because that's not how they roll in the heartland. And so we did get back to our roots and the values of the heartland consumers. And for a consumer that can often feel overlooked and underrepresented, they saw themselves. And our business stabilized in the first year, and it grew 5% the next year. So getting in touch with your own values and the values of the consumer isn't just the right thing to do. It's good for business.
Great. So Steve, has that also been your experience, having worked for some of these companies with very strong roots in the Midwest, that there is a difference there in terms of supply and customers, economic conditions, culture, all the things that our other panel members talked about?
Well, I think that a lot of the large companies in the Midwest today are global, and every company in the world has multiple constituents: customers, employees, owners, and community. And as most companies have, they've got global customers, they have global owners, and they have some dispersion of employees. But I think what you see is a concentration of employees near the headquarters, in this case near the Heartland, and the makeup of those employees are made from the communities. And so I think you then have to look to what are those community makeups. And the United States is a nation of immigrants, and the Heartland is a nation of specific immigrants. If you look at the historical makeup of the population in most of the counties throughout this heartland, they're of German descent, of German majority descent. And then when you get to the southern part, it's the African American descent. But then you have Norway and Sweden in the upper parts of it. The reason that's important is because those values from those home countries are carried over. My own grandparents came from Norway to Minnesota 100 years ago, and you see the characteristics of the German, the Northern Europeans, the self-reliance, the socially tolerant characteristics come over, and those are part of the company values that Janine was talking about. So they also came in the agricultural age, and they came for cheap farmland and abundant supply, and so you see a great concentration of agricultural roots. So the Heartland carries over these characteristics and values today, I think.
Okay, well that's good, because in fact there was a question there where somebody was indeed asking about, what are these Heartland values now exactly? And I think both of you, Janine and Steve, sort of helped us to work that through a little bit. Okay, so we have now a clear idea, at least a clearer idea, about what the Heartland really is about. I think this is a good time now to actually ask our audience a question. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that the region has, and we already identified some of those. So there's a poll question coming up that we would like all of you to answer. And that poll question really is, what do you see as the most important challenge in the American heartland? And there are a couple of options here. Is the most important challenge unfavorable demographics in terms of natural population growth and migration? Is it over-reliance on old industries, including agriculture, for example? Is it industry composition for low-income economies, or China included there? Over-reliance on natural resources, poverty, healthcare, social welfare challenges, or is it short-term thinking rather than long-term strategy and policy? Or is it just because, there's an unfavorable perception in the rest of the country with regard to the heartland, and it's just not right? So, a lot of options here. You also have another option. If you have another option, we'd love to hear from you through the chat box what you think your option would be. But let's see, how people respond. Let's give it a few more seconds, because there's a lot of possibilities that you can look at. And then I'm going to ask each of our panel members to sort of give a very brief response to it, and then we'll take a little bit more of a deep dive in some of these challenges that we're looking at. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's stop it now. So actually it's pretty widespread in terms of respondents, but still 28% of you are saying it's an over-reliance on traditional old industries. 18.7% are saying no, it's really unfavorable demographics and human capital and the natural migration issues, people moving out of the region. Industry competition from other low-income countries is mentioned also. Poverty, healthcare, social welfare. So comments are a bit spread. So what I take from this, and let me start with you, Ross, just 30 seconds. There's a lot of problems, and they're pretty widespread.
There are, and I would agree with the poll results. I guess if you asked me to pick one, and I just wrote an op-ed in today's Tennessean on this, I would choose short-term thinking rather than long-term strategic planning and policy. I think we've tended to look at the economy as if we were doing a short-term weather forecast, and certainly reliance on traditional industries such as agriculture and traditional manufacturing are part of that mix. But to me, you need to develop a plan in order to understand what direction you're headed in, and I just don't think we've been doing enough of that in the heartland.
Thomas, which one would you pick?
Well, it's interesting. I would pick the same as Ross, and I would push back against the over-reliance because I don't think you really get to choose your industries. I don't think you can pick them and rely. I mean, you rely on them, but you can't really pick them. I think it has to do with geography, the inherent geography that where industries locate. And so I would agree with Ross that short-term thinking can be a real problem, and emphasize that I think policymakers, rather than I think there's a tendency to chase fads in terms of economic development. I think it's more important to focus on just efficient provision of government services, and I think that's the best way to. And I think that's a long-term thing. That's the best way to kind of position yourself for future growth.
And we'll come back to some of those initiatives that are being undertaken to try to do that. Janine, where would you put yourself when you think about the biggest challenges, and what do you think of those?
I think from a consumer insights perspective, I think the last one about, I don't know about unfavorable perception, I think it's more a favorable perception of the coastal population, and I think their voice is amplified to a degree that the Heartlands is not. And I think to that degree, the Heartland is not as well served, perhaps by the different industries as they could be if their voice was in better proportion to all the rest of America.
Steve, do you see this as a widespread range of problems, or just that we don't quite know what?
No, look, I've lived and worked in 4 of the states in the Heartland, but 6 other states, including both coasts. I think the issues are very similar around the country, except that the coasts don't have the preponderance of the rural concentration that the Heartland does. And so I see the differences and would define the differences as urban differences and rural differences. Those big urban centers of Detroit and Chicago, St. Louis, those issues tend to look the same as the coast. It's the rural difference that I think the Heartland differentiates itself with, and that's where you see some differences in migration out and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point that you're making here, and we'll come back to that later when we talk about rural versus urban. And to some extent, maybe this is more a difference between rural and urban than a difference between Heartland and the rest of the country. So I think that's a very, very valid point to be made. Let's take a little bit more of a deep dive, move back to the slides. And Ross, there is this perception that, and I'll show you this next slide, that sort of the Heartland has kind of stopped converging on the rest of America, particularly since the financial crisis in 2008-09. You can see some lines here that actually show that the Heartland was doing actually well in catching up with the rest, but then it started to, particularly in terms of GDP and job creation, to basically diverge again. Why is this, and to what extent is this related to issues like industrial structure and labor market and wages and things like that?
Well, clearly the Heartland has been converging, mainly the southern parts of the Heartland, and lesser performance in the northern part of the Heartland. I would say that many of the Heartland states, especially the southern states, did not maintain critical investments in the innovation economy, the knowledge-based economy, whatever you want to frame it. And then kind of add in the aftermath of the Great Recession. Per capita income gaps are closing, but it's began to stall, and it really is primarily due to as full participation in the innovation-based economy as is necessary. And also, as Steve pointed out, you have rural pockets that do not have much involvement in high value-added economic activity. And there's also these lingering intergenerational effects that we sometimes downplay of low educational attainment, poverty, unhealthy behaviors, think of opioid crisis and obesity, and high rates of chronic disease. Certainly the mechanization of agriculture in the South and high value-added manufacturing has harmed it. You've seen labor force participation rates in many of the rural areas of the southern Heartland in particular that are very low. And because the South especially has more of a rural composition, there are less innovation assets. So think of research universities, federal laboratories that can be used to promote economic growth. So certainly there's some challenges. We need to see greater investments in higher education, especially in the STEM areas, and that's going to be necessary to advance economic growth in the Heartland.
Right. So, Thomas, as an economist, you look sort of really at these short-term trends. I know sort of looking at some recent figures, it's actually interesting. You mentioned manufacturing already. Some of both Ross and yourself mentioned manufacturing earlier. Recently, we actually have seen some pretty good numbers coming out of manufacturing in that part of the world. So is there something changing to the dynamic, or is this just short term that we're looking at, and that longer term we're still facing these challenges that are being identified here?
Yes, I mean, I think you're right that manufacturing's done pretty well in the recovery. It's been pretty widespread. I wouldn't characterize it as. Well, it depends. The auto industry had a really bad recession and then had a very strong recovery. I still wouldn't characterize it as like a super strong recovery. It's definitely recovered and it's been widespread. And I think we've also seen across the country, including the Heartland, we've seen other indicators of economic indicators looking good. Think like the unemployment rate's low pretty much everywhere. In terms of cyclical stuff, things look good, including in the Heartland. From a business perspective, the unemployment rate being low everywhere means that the labor market's tight everywhere. It's hard to find workers, regardless of skill level. But yeah, no. In the end, I do think it's manufacturing. I'm going to keep mentioning manufacturing, not just because it's important to the Midwest, but it's important to the Heartland. Manufacturing I expect it to continue to struggle in terms of being a relatively slow growth industry, and the same with agriculture. And the reason I think that is that as incomes have grown over the past, say, 5 decades, we've seen a smaller and smaller share of people's incomes be spent on physical things and food, and places where and I don't see that necessarily reversing, and so the places that are concentrated in manufacturing and agriculture, it's going to seems to me that it's going to continue to be the case that they're going to have slower growth and demand than other places that are concentrated in higher growth industries. But I don't think that means that places that are slower growth are not going to be nice places to live or not be prosperous places. We're still seeing incomes grow there, but in the Heartland. But I don't necessarily see the an extremely bright future in relative terms, based solely on the industry mix.
So Janine, let's talk a little bit about demand and the consumer. And Thomas referred to incomes and labor market, which have been improving in that part of the world too. But the consumer, in the Heartland has quite a bit of catching up to do. Are they still challenged, or would you say today, the consumer in the Heartland states are doing as well as in the rest of the country?
It depends on the industry. As we talk about, is the Heartland underperforming or overperforming? It's such a generalization. I think it depends on the industry. It depends on companies within the industry. We see, the consumers in the Heartland, their values have pulled through, their incomes relative to what they're used to have been very consistent. And so, for General Mills, we haven't seen how the Heartland underperform relative to the rest of the country for our sales. And, when you think about, trends that consumers are talking about, and they start on the coast, it is true that the health trends did not take root in the Heartland, but they don't have to embrace the hot trends in order for that region to be a viable business proposition. It's really about giving the Heartland what they want and represent who they are. And for we have what they want. We've got a very broad portfolio. We're in service to the hottest on food trends with brands like Annie's and Larabar, but we have legacy brands that cater to Heartland tastes and needs and traditional family values. And so we looked at what are those categories that are over-indexing in the Heartland, and it is things like pizza and desserts and dry packaged dinners like Hamburger Helper. We are disproportionately growing in the Heartland on brands like Totino's Pizza or our Betty Crocker dessert mixes and our refrigerated dough. So the Heartland is actually a very important region for us. Those consumers are very relevant to what we do. So you can win in this region, but it has to be on their terms, and it may be counter to the trend.
Interesting, yeah. So yeah, you're very right. You need to look at different industries. You also need to look at different sort of consumer categories, if you like, and that goes back to some of the cultural values that you were talking about earlier. So, Steve, there has been this concern about sort of over-reliance on specific industries in some areas like natural resources or agriculture has been talked about. How do you break through that? And maybe you can also, you were previously CEO of the Committee for Regional Development, looking at this from a policy perspective. I mean, to what extent can policymakers in the regulatory environment has been playing a role or can help us to make the economies more diversified?
Yeah, really good questions. And I think as Thomas said, this region, but every region, is characterized by its geography and history, and this is no different. So the industries there are driven largely by that, as is every region, and that's why the United States and large continents make up a vital economic mix. Obviously there's a big rural section. This is our breadbasket of our country, and also it's a breadbasket for many countries around the world. So you've got all things agriculture, so farming with Cargill, farm machinery with Caterpillar and Deere, ag chemicals from Monsanto and ADM, animal feed from Walstrom Purina, ethanol from ADM and Valero, food and co-ops, General Mills, Sara Lee, Land O'Lakes, Ingredient, Kellogg's, Kraft Heinz, ConAgra, Smucker. You've got meat companies like Tyson, Sara Lee, Smithfield, Oscar Mayer, Hormel, Pilgrim's Pride. You have Anheuser-Busch, a grain-based company in a different sense, and the big cotton-growing region, which is whose capital is Memphis. And then you have this great shipping and transportation sector because of its geography. So you've got this great waterway in the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers all converging, and the massive amounts of cargo that come up and down that waterway, as well as the Great Lakes region, which feeds the iron ore and everything out to the Atlantic Ocean. You have the great air hubs for cargo in Memphis and Indianapolis and so forth. So all of these industries come together, and therefore the policies that are driven from these companies and industries, as well as the politicians in the area for the obvious reasons, are focused on those areas. So from a policy standpoint, you have all of the agricultural policies, including subsidies, the dairy, the pricing, the import controls. It's questionable whether the protectionism has been a good thing or a bad thing for a Midwest, and we could do a whole webcast on that, but over the long run, these policies have been part of those industries. You have the whole right to work issues in those states, and the traction and the movement of the whole auto industry from the north to the south. Tennessee has Nissan and VW, Alabama has Hyundai and Honda, Kentucky has Toyota. So the regulation that has come from all of this needs to be deployed in order to level the playing field and protect the consumers. But then I think most of these companies are out talking about making sure that the markets are left to work. So I would say that those are the key policy areas, all driven again by the geography and the history of the region. Bart, I think we can't hear you, Bart, so I think you're either breaking up or muted. Okay. Well, listen, Bart, we can't hear you, but maybe if I could just pitch in here and ask everyone to share some of the experiences of the good initiatives that you've seen to help stem or turn the tide of the decline in the area, initiatives on ecosystems and government and so forth, and maybe some examples. Ross, maybe we could start with you.
I'd be glad to, Steve. I'd point towards the example of the Nashville metropolitan area. it has been one of the premier economic success stories in the Heartland. Nashville was 5th in the large metro category and 26th overall in our most recent, most dynamic metropolitans that we just released this month. Nashville's real GDP grew over 4% in 2017, placing the Music City 5th overall among metros with a gross metro product of above 100 billion. It has a unique combination of what I would call EDS, or education, meds, medical, auto manufacturing, logistics, and supply chain fulfillment that's really been boosting job and wage growth. And also, I think what's unique about Nashville is it is among the best in thinking strategically about its future and developing an economic development plan that's based on a highly collaborative model between government, businesses, higher education, and community leaders. And also, let me just point towards this, supporting small businesses in becoming medium-sized businesses. Scale Nashville is an example of a competitive program to support early-stage entrepreneurs, helping them build the skills that are necessary to do so. They have a hashtag called hashtag Nashpreneurs that really supports them, and the government has been supporting this effort through technical, financial, and marketing research services. And also, Nashville is among the leaders in the share of employment at young firms defined as 5 years of age or less. And I think that's really something that's unique in the Heartland. And Nashville has been witnessing higher in-migration and out-migration of about 25,000 a year. And so it's been a very integrative approach amongst all the members of the ecosystem that are promoting Nashville.
Right. Bart, have we got your audio back? Okay,
Yes.
carry
Can
on.
you hear me
Yes,
now?
thanks.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, it was a little break from Holland. Sorry about that. So I love these initiatives. So Janine, let me ask you about one. You actually talked a little bit earlier already when you introduced about how you're working with customers in the region. Give us another example of some really nice initiatives that you see help the Heartland to, revive and to flourish.
Yeah. I got a couple examples. One is as we think about our plants and the need to make sure we skill up our resources, our workforce by partnering with education. And so, we need to continue to upskill our employees. And as you think about agricultural and manufacturing, it is going to be continually technically advanced, and we need to have workers that can thrive in that world. And so General Mills partners with local tech schools to make sure that our plant techs have what they need to continue to grow and remain competitive, in this workforce. So that is one of our initiatives. Another one, I just want to build on what Ross said about supporting small businesses. I mean, in our own small way, our convenience and food service division, they have a neighborhood to nation recipe contest, and it's really focused on those independent restaurant owners, the ones that create those signature dishes that instill a great source of pride, in the hometown and in the region. And we've had several winners, from the Heartland. And it's important to celebrate all cuisine, not just healthy, trendy, but cuisine that represents your area. And how that helps build the reputation of the region is they get awards and PR. And this really puts a spotlight on the Heartland and their proclivity for unapologetic indulgence. Our winner last year was a guy running a food truck in Tulsa, Arkansas, who came up with a sea salt caramel bacon pecan pie. You're not going to see that in California. And I thought that was just a great way to celebrate the cuisine of the Heartland.
Fantastic, great examples. Thomas, as an economist, can you beat this?
No, and I mean, I think it seems like I'm always echoing Ross. I think, in my experience talking to business or to leaders in the Midwest. An example of a city that's been doing well recently is Indianapolis, and in talking to the leadership there, they really did want to emphasize the amount of cooperation and collaboration that's gone on between the government leaders, business leaders, and nonprofit institutions and educational institutions in working through a region's problems, a local economic area's problems and challenges. And I don't think that's I think there are certainly plenty of places that have struggled too that really try to collaborate across leadership roles as well. But I think that's certainly an important ingredient and something that can't be missed is cooperation at the leadership level in a metro area.
Steve, there are two questions here that I'd like to throw at you, and let's see if you have a thought about this. So one question is, will the Heartland benefit by increasing telecommuting? Could someone in the finance industry earn New York salaries while living in a low-cost Midwest area? And then another question is, what are specific problems that companies of high value-added services face when they operate in the Heartland? Any thoughts on those two questions?
This telecommuting thing is a really interesting idea. Most companies now have converted call centers to virtual call centers, and you see most of the virtual call centers happening throughout the Midwest, where moms are at home and they pick up a couple hours of work here and there while they're dealing with their families and so forth. So I think this idea of telecommuting is brilliant and is happening. The irony on the flip side is, though, that millennials as a generation are less likely to like telecommuting than baby boomers. It's ironic, but millennials want to go to offices and so forth. And so you see the new industries like the high tech and Amazon and Facebook having to locate in urban centers as a result of that. So the other thing is the whole 5G phenomenon requires these very short distant receivers, and so as we move into 4G, it's going to be a huge issue for rural areas. So you'll see some of the differences there. From a high value-added service standpoint, I think that the employees in the Midwest are uniformly highly educated, literate, hardworking. Anytime you stereotype or generalize, you're wrong. But these are great workforces throughout the region, and I think the service industries can benefit from it. A couple other quick points. Public and private partnerships are more widely used on average. University partnerships, and you've got great state universities, Minnesota, Michigan, Tennessee, Iowa, Purdue, that all are working very closely with the business community. They know they need to do that in this region, and you see that more, I think, than the coastal areas.
Great. So let's...
Bart, I think we lost your audio again. It's cutting out. Yeah, okay, so Bart, it's a long way from Holland, folks, and it's a communication issue. We'll get him back here in a minute. But I think we've got a little bit of a move here to the next poll question. If we could put that up for our viewers. Over the next decade, the question is what I expect to see in the Heartland. Will I see a further deterioration in economic performance? Will, on balance, that there be just some deterioration, or will it improve? Will it utilize its strengths and continue to converge? And so polls are open now. If we could get everyone to go in and register your votes. We'll leave this open here for a minute, but the question is, where is this going over the next decade? Will there be further deterioration in economic performance? Will there be some balance, or will it improve on balance? Let's just give this another minute. Bart, I don't know if we can hear you yet. Anytime that you want to try to cut in, do so, and take back over. Just another couple of seconds on this. Okay, let's freeze this. So I think if you look at the polls, on balance, it looks like over half of our respondents say that things will improve, but there'll still be large areas of economic and business distress, followed by the next highest group saying that it still should deteriorate a little bit. Ross, what are your reactions to this?
Well, on this one, that's how I would have answered. I think we will see more Nashvilles coming out of the Heartland. I live in one. They call it Northwest Arkansas here, the Fayetteville, Rogers, Springdale, Bentonville area has been performing very well. So I think we're going to see more pockets of this. Des Moines, Iowa has been doing much better in recent years. Financial services has been driving that activity. So on balance, I would agree with that assessment.
Yeah. And Thomas, your thoughts?
I actually agree with the poll here too, but not necessarily because I see manufacturing or agriculture being a huge job growth engine, but I think because of what's happened on the coast, where we've seen, in response to these strongly growing economies, we've seen housing prices go way up. And, it's gotten very expensive to buy a home or rent in a lot of the places with the fastest growing income. And I think that's kind of created an advantage for places in the Midwest where there are where there are educated people, where the tech industry or other growth industries can take advantage of the lower cost of living. So I think that's, unless the coast can figure out their housing affordability problems, I think that is something that is going to help the Heartland kind of maybe close the gap some between the Heartland and the rest of the country.
There's relatively cheap housing throughout the rural areas, but also some of the urban areas. You see Detroit, tearing down whole sections of abandoned homes and offering very low cost or free land. So there's urban renewal going on in the Midwest.
Yeah, I mean, I would, it can't just be, I would say, low housing costs, because I think one thing that I would emphasize about moving, the finance from, say, New York City to Des Moines is you can move some, I think, like you mentioned, you can move some of the back office stuff there, but, one of the things that regional economics emphasizes a ton are these agglomeration effects, and that's just that for whatever reason, people in close proximity, there are primarily, I think it's knowledge spillovers that, say, the finance industry takes advantage of, that have been pushing people to the coast just because being in the same place seems to really matter for keeping up with what's going on, what's the very latest. And I think that's going to continue to be the case for a lot of these industries, even though the Midwest is going to be a bargain in terms of housing.
Yeah, I think that's right. So Janine, it says that the poll says on balance this is going to improve, and that must be because the cuisine is going to drive it. What are your thoughts?
That's what I'm talking about, right? I mean, I'm in the camp of the second one, where we recognize sizable pockets of strong performance. And again, as a researcher, we're always looking for the anomaly. We're always looking for what's different that can be leveraged for growth. And so the mining there never ends in terms of the mining of the data, the mining of the culture. And so what we see as opportunity, and what we love about the Heartland and their values and their cuisine and their foods is we know that. And so it is hard to decode, emerging health trends and what those answers look like, but we know this, gang. And so we continue to see opportunity there, and still pockets of strong.
Yeah, that's great. Bart, can we hear from you?
So, yeah, you can hear me.
All
again.
right.
So thank you for stepping in again, Steve. Great, and we'll just move on. We're running a little over time because this is a really interesting conversation. There are actually some more questions also. So what I'm going to do, Ross, I'm really going to ask you to spend a couple of minutes, because you got some interesting insights from a recent study that Heartland Forward has done, focusing particularly on the metro areas in the Heartland, and focusing a little bit more on science and technology and innovation, so that's sort of a really modern industry. Can you quickly, if my colleagues can show up the slides again, and then we'll take a few questions at the end and try to wrap up on time.
Thanks, Bart. I think this is slide 7. It says, yeah, that's it. This is some work that I did at the Milken Institute, and my staff just updated this data. It's called the State Technology and Science Index. And this looks at technology and science workforce, and there are about 38 occupations in this category. Let me just say that human capital is very important, and it's really the technology and science workforce that indicates whether regions have the necessary skills to participate in the knowledge-based economy. So a region's most important competitive advantage is highly mobile, geographically discriminating human capital. The states in this map that are in dark blue are in the top 10, and then you have shades all the way down to kind of the light gray, light blue. The states in the light blue are really at a competitive disadvantage. You will note that Minnesota is among the top 10 in terms of concentration of technology and science workforce. You also have Texas and Ohio that are kind of there in the second tier. So that's one thing I would point out, that we need more investment in the heartland in those areas. The next slide I want to show really quickly is slide 11. I think it's really insightful. This comes from a report that we just released this month, Most Dynamic Metropolitans. It's a map with dots on it. It says Most Dynamic Metropolitans. There it is, yes. So we have the heartland states there in green outline, and it really emphasizes the importance of entrepreneurship in terms of the process of company formation and growth that are crucial. And this is what we call the young firm ratio, so the percent of total employment in a metropolitan area that's represented by firms that are 5 years of age or less. And it really shows those areas around the country that are in that upper tier in green. You'll notice in the West, many of them are concentrated in California. But it also shows several in Texas that have done very well. And those places that are really supporting entrepreneurs in terms of their economic development strategies, working to provide the skills, the connections that are necessary, building those ecosystems, whether that's incubators, accelerators, and a whole variety of spaces. These metropolitan areas are more dynamic and resilient. As an example, out of the top 100 metros overall in our most dynamic metropolitan rankings, 88 of them had a young firm share above the metropolitan average. So if you look at the number of red dots there that are around the Great Lakes states, you will see that they're heavily concentrated there. And that's one of the reasons why many of those metropolitan areas are not performing as well. If I could go to the State Technology and Science Index, slide 10, very quickly, kind of recap it. This would be another map. Here we go. So once again, this just brings all these different categories together. There's about 107 different components that comprise this index, and it really shows how important technology and science is to economic development. Now, the star in the heartland is Minnesota. It ranks 7th overall among all states in the Technology and Science Index. But also notice that Illinois was 16th, Michigan was 18th, Texas was 20th, and Wisconsin was 22nd. Also, I have to point out that many of the southern states in the heartland were in the bottom 10. And lastly, just let me make a point on slide 10 that says innovate to create high-wage jobs. So I've shown you all these different measures, but what does it really mean overall for people and places? So this is a busy chart, but if you compare the State Technology and Science Index and where a state was positioned, as opposed to average annual pay across the 50 states, you can explain 75% of the variation in overall differences in average annual pay based upon how well states performed on this index. So this just demonstrates how important it is, especially in the Southern Heartland, to invest more heavily in these areas.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, great charts, and actually there's really good feedback also in the question box on people really would love those charts. Here's what I'm going to do. We're running a little bit out of time. I want to ask all the 3 other speakers or panelists here a few questions that have come up, and then let you each make a comment on whatever question you want to comment on. So one question is about broadband, and that's still broadband in the rural areas, and maybe this is not just a heartland problem, this is a rural versus urban problem, is driving people to the cities because, that's if you want to engage with the rest of the world. So if anybody has a comment on that, on the issue around broadband would be great. It's a great question around venture capital really seems to be lagging in the heartland, and that goes back, Ross, to some of the issues that you're talking about, because obviously you need venture capital if you want to drive these technology initiatives. Why is it, and why is it hard to get venture capital to the region? And then finally, and this may be a question also for you, particularly Janine, is agricultural technology. And what are the opportunities for agricultural technology, and how can that help to drive innovation and better jobs in the region? So let me start with you. Pick up whatever question you want to pick up on, any other comment that you want to make on the discussion so far, and then we'll wrap up. So Janine, let me go to you first.
Yeah, agriculture is just the cornerstone of how we are thinking about our future, especially with brands like Annie's and Epic, where that is a big part of their culture and in their long-range plan. So agriculture is obviously critical to our business. As such, we are innovating by investing time and money to further research and application, very particularly around regenerative agriculture and applications of that like Kernza. These are farming practices that are good for farmers. It's more profitable. It's good for business. It's a more resilient supply chain. It's good for the planet.